Imagine you are a midwife in ancient Rome. You have done this hundreds of times. You know the sounds, the silences, the weight of the moment, and then the baby arrives. And the room goes quiet in a different way, not the held breath quiet of waiting. The stunned quiet of something no one knows what to do with. What you are looking at does not have a name. It does not have an explanation. And in a world where everything that happens has a reason, the gods, the stars, the sins of the mother, something this visible and this wrong can only mean one thing. Something went very, very badly. Birth defects are as old as humanity. They have been found in Egyptian mummies, described in Mesopotamian clay tablets, painted on ancient Greek pottery. They terrified people. They fascinated people. And depending on the civilization and the century, they were interpreted as a curse, a prophecy, a punishment, or in some cases, a sacred sign from the gods themselves. The Romans had a formal word for them, Monstra, from the Latin root meaning to warn or to show. An unusual birth was not just a medical event. It was a message. Roman priests called haruspices were consulted after every unusual birth, the same way they were consulted after lightning struck a temple or a comet crossed the sky. The birth was logged, the interpretation was issued, and the city responded accordingly. Today, we understand what causes most of them, and the science is both simpler and stranger than any ancient explanation ever was. Let's start with the most terrifying one. Anencephaly. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets called omen texts listed every possible physical abnormality a newborn could present. These were not casual notes. They were official state documents, written by trained scribes, preserved in royal archives. Alongside each abnormality were formal predictions. If a woman gives birth to a child with this feature, it means this will happen to the city, to the king, to the harvest. Anencephaly was among the most documented. A baby born without the upper portions of the brain and skull, eyes open, a face, but the skull above absent, replaced by exposed tissue or simply nothing at all. These births were treated as catastrophic omens. The tablets were not medical records, they were warnings. The Babylonian Shuma Alu, one of the oldest omen series ever discovered, dedicates entire sections to recording these births and their predicted consequences. A child born this way meant disaster was coming. The only question was what kind. What ancient priests could not know is that anencephaly is a neural tube defect. During the first 4 weeks of pregnancy, before most women even know they are pregnant, a structure called the neural tube forms. It is the biological foundation of the entire brain and spinal cord. When it fails to close properly at the top, anencephaly is the result. The cause, a combination of genetic vulnerability and severe folic acid deficiency in the mother. A single B vitamin, one nutrient absent at the wrong moment, and the brain does not form. These infants rarely survive beyond a few days. Ancient civilizations did not need to understand the biology to understand the outcome. They saw the result and built entire systems of meaning around it. What is striking is that the records survived at all. These births were being documented, cataloged, cross-referenced, and filed in state archives thousands of years ago. The Mesopotamians were doing something that looked almost like epidemiology. They were tracking abnormalities over time and looking for patterns. They just interpreted the patterns as divine rather than biological. The science told us what the meaning actually was. They just had the mechanism wrong. Spina bifida, this one is different, because the child survives. Spina bifida occurs when that same neural tube fails to close, but at the bottom, not the top. The spine forms incompletely. The cord is exposed or covered only by skin, sometimes bulging outward as a visible sac on the back. Depending on severity, a person with spina bifida might live with partial paralysis, loss of sensation in the legs, or difficulty with basic bodily functions. In mild cases, the visible signs are almost none at all. And here is where it gets interesting. Archaeological evidence shows these individuals lived. Skeletal remains from ancient populations in Egypt, Europe, and the Americas show spinal abnormalities consistent with spina bifida. And crucially, signs of long-term survival. These were not abandoned at birth. Someone fed them. Someone cared for them for years, sometimes decades. There is evidence closer to home than you might expect. Researchers studying the skeletal remains of Tutankhamun, the Egyptian pharaoh, the famous boy king, found multiple congenital conditions, including spinal abnormalities consistent with mild spina bifida, alongside a clubfoot and bone disease. The most powerful figure in the ancient world, the living god of Egypt, may have walked with a cane. His tomb contained 130 walking sticks. Most historians assume they were symbolic. They may simply have been practical. Ancient Rome had a formal concept for unusual births, the prodigy. A prodigium required religious response, and the response was not always destruction. Sometimes it was ritual, prayer, atonement, The child became living evidence of divine communication, and living evidence in certain cases was kept alive to preserve the message. Same neural tube, same folic acid deficiency pathway as anencephaly. Two completely different outcomes depending on which end of the tube fails to close. Congenital heart defect. Here is the thing about a defective heart, you cannot see it. The baby looks normal. The birth goes normally. The mother holds the child, and nothing appears wrong. And then the child turns blue. In ancient civilizations, the heart was not just an organ. It was the seat of the soul. In Egypt, it was weighed against a feather in the afterlife. If your heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it failed the test and you were destroyed. In Greece, it was the source of thought and emotion. In Hebrew tradition, it was the center of will and desire. When the heart worked differently, when the blood moved wrong, when the lungs could not keep up, when the child's lips turned the color of a bruise, it carried the full weight of that symbolism. A child born with a defective heart was not just sick. In the ancient framework of meaning, their soul was already wrong. Congenital heart defects are the most common birth defect today. Roughly 1 in every 100 births. Many go undetected, many self-correct, but the severe ones produce visible, undeniable signs. The Greek physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century AD, documented observations of hearts in both living patients and dissected animals with extraordinary precision. He noted structural variations. He identified chambers and vessels. He came remarkably close to understanding circulation, and then drew the wrong conclusions from correct observations, sending European medicine in the wrong direction for over 1,000 years. The cause of congenital heart defects is a failure in cardiac development between weeks 4 and 8 of pregnancy. Genetic mutations, chromosomal abnormalities, viral infections in the mother, rubella in particular is devastating to cardiac development. Certain medications, alcohol. The heart is the first organ to function. It is also the first that can go wrong. For most of human history, a blue baby did not survive. Ancient physicians noted the discoloration. Some attributed it to maternal emotion during pregnancy, others to celestial events. The most honest of them simply wrote, "The child was born this way. There was nothing to be done." The first successful surgery to correct a congenital heart defect was performed in 1944 by Dr. Alfred Blalock at Johns Hopkins. The surgery itself was technically executed by a lab technician named Vivian Thomas, a black man with no medical degree, who had spent years perfecting the technique on dogs in the basement laboratory. He stood behind Blalock during the operation and guided him through every step. Blalock received the credit. Thomas received a janitor's uniform. The medical establishment only formally acknowledged his contribution decades later. Until that surgery existed, a severe congenital heart defect was a death sentence handed out on the first day of life. For all of human history before 1944, ancient or otherwise, it was the same outcome. Cleft lip and palate. This one is survivable. And that made it complicated. A cleft lip is a gap in the upper lip where tissue will fuse during fetal development. A cleft palate is the same failure further back in the roof of the mouth. Together, they affect feeding, speech, and facial appearance in ways that are immediately and permanently visible. In ancient Rome and medieval Europe, a cleft lip was associated with witchcraft. The belief was widespread that a pregnant woman had been startled by a hare during pregnancy, and the fright had physically marked the child. The term harelip carried this association for centuries. The mother was not just unlucky, she was suspected. In some communities, a cleft birth triggered a formal inquest. Had the woman consorted with unusual animals? Had she been walking in fields at the wrong hour? The defect was treated as evidence of something she had done. The consequences for the mother could be severe. But in other cultures, a cleft was sacred. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, Tlaloc, the rain deity, one of the most powerful gods in the Aztec pantheon, was depicted with a cleft upper lip. Images of Tlaloc appear across centuries of Mesoamerican art, always with that characteristic split. Children born with the same feature were sometimes given to his temples. The abnormality was read not as punishment, but as divine marking. You were born resembling a god. That was not a tragedy. That was an assignment. The genetics behind cleft lip and palate are genuinely complex. Not a single gene, not a single chromosome. Multiple interacting genes across multiple chromosomal locations combined with environmental factors. Folic acid deficiency again, smoking during pregnancy, certain anticonvulsant medications, even high altitude in some studies. The risk is real and the pathways are still being mapped. And some ancient cultures did not wait for the gods to fix it. They fixed it themselves. Chinese medical texts from as early as 390 AD describe a formal surgical technique for repairing cleft lip. The physician Wei Yizhi recorded a procedure involving sutures to close the gap. with specific guidance on patient positioning and wound care. The operation worked. The patient could eat, speak, and move through society without identification. A 4th century Chinese surgeon was performing facial reconstructive surgery with thread and a blade in a world that had no anesthesia, no germ theory, and no understanding of what caused the condition he was repairing. He was figuring out plastic surgery nearly 1,500 years before the field had a name. Polydactyly, the extra finger knot. All birth defects read as horror, some read as power. Polydactyly is the presence of extra fingers or toes. It is relatively common, roughly 1 in 500 births, and in most cases, the extra digit is small and only partially functional. In many ancient cultures, extra fingers were not a defect. They were a mark of distinction. In the Hebrew Bible, a warrior named Goliath of Gath is described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total. In ancient Anatolia, ritual figurines with 6-fingered hands were placed in temples. In indigenous cultures of the American Southwest, cave paintings depicting 6-fingered handprints appear across multiple archaeological sites, centuries apart, and skeletal remains from the Chaco Canyon civilization, one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian cultures in North America, show that polydactyly was present in the population, and those individuals appear to have held elevated social status. Their bones were found in ritual spaces. They were not excluded, they were central. The extra digit was not hidden, it was displayed. History also offers a more personal example. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry V, was widely rumored by her enemies to have had a 6th finger on her right hand. The rumor was almost certainly exaggerated for political purposes. She had rivals who needed reasons to destroy her. But the fact that the extra finger was used as an accusation tells you something about how the English Tudor court read unusual bodies. What was divine in Chaco Canyon was demonic in London. The cause of polydactyly is genetic, autosomal dominant in most cases, meaning one copy of the variant gene is enough to produce the trait. It runs in families clearly and consistently. Ancient communities noticed this. The same bloodline, generation after generation, carrying the same extra finger, and in certain cultures, that repeating pattern was not read as defect. It was read as lineage mark, evidence of something being passed forward with intention. The gods, they believed, were choosing a family and marking it visibly. What they were actually observing was basic Mendelian inheritance, centuries before Mendel was born. Cyclopia and the myth it created, some birth defects did not just frighten ancient cultures. They generated mythology that survived for 3,000 years. Cyclopias is a condition in which the 2 embryonic eye fields fail to separate during fetal development. The result is a single eye, or partial eye, positioned centrally in the face, where the nose would normally form. The nose itself may be absent or displaced above the eye as a small fleshy tube. It is always fatal. These infants do not survive beyond a few days, but their skulls survive. And when ancient peoples found the skull of a dwarf elephant, a species that once lived across the Mediterranean islands, they saw a large central nasal cavity that to an untrained eye looked exactly like a single massive eye socket. The skulls were real. They were enormous, and they produced what may be the most durable monster in all of human mythology, the Cyclops. There is a parallel, quieter version of this in human birth. Cyclopia in human fetuses results from a condition called holoprosencephaly, the failure of the forebrain to divide properly into 2 hemispheres. Ancient midwives who witnessed these births and survived the experience reported them. Ancient artists occasionally depicted them. And into the empty space where understanding should have been, the human mind placed exactly what it always does, a monster with a story attached. The science of Cyclopia also reveals something important. The same signaling pathways involved in holoprosencephaly, the sonic hedgehog pathway, which is genuinely what it is called, are involved in normal facial development across all vertebrates. When researchers study why the face forms the way it does, they are studying the same molecular mechanisms that, when disrupted, produce cyclopia. Understanding the defect led directly to understanding normal development. The monster, studied carefully enough, explains how the face works. Down syndrome, the defect that appeared in art in 1866, a British physician named John Langdon Down formally described a pattern of features he had, observed across many patients. The syndrome that carries his name was not new. It had simply never been categorized. Because the evidence in ancient art is striking, pre-Columbian ceramic figurines from Colombia, dated to the 5th and 6th centuries AD, depict human faces with features consistent with Down syndrome. The characteristic facial structure, the posture, the proportions. These were not accidental imperfections in the clay. They were intentional portraits. The features were rendered deliberately, repeated across multiple figurines from the same culture. Medieval European art contains similar examples. Certain paintings depicting the Christ child and surrounding figures show facial features that modern physicians reviewing the images have identified as consistent with Down syndrome. Whether this was conscious representation or coincidental is debated. What is not debated is that individuals with Down syndrome were present in these communities and visible enough to appear in formal artistic records. Down syndrome is caused by trisomy 21, the presence of a third copy of chromosome 21. It occurs across all human populations, all geographies, all time periods. The incidence increases with maternal age. Ancient communities would have noticed this too. Older mothers more likely to produce children with certain features. That observation would have been absorbed into the cultural framework of bad blood or weakened constitution with age without any understanding of the chromosomal mechanism underneath. The risk of having a child with Down syndrome at age 20 is roughly 1 in 1,500. At age 45, it is roughly 1 in 30. Ancient populations had children across their entire fertile lifespan. The incidence was real and consistent. The art suggests these individuals were not invisible. They were present. They were depicted. What those communities made of them, spiritually, socially, practically, varied enormously by place and era, but they were there. The fear of bad blood, every culture that encountered birth defects arrived at the same conclusion. This can happen again. The observation was correct. The explanation was always wrong. Ancient Mesopotamians believed a mother's behavior during pregnancy caused the defect. What she saw, what she feared, what she ate, what she thought. This placed moral blame onto the mother and implied the defect was preventable. If she had simply not done the wrong thing, the child would have been born right. This logic survived into relatively modern medicine. In the 1800s, physicians were still formally documenting maternal impressions. The clinical theory that a frightened or emotionally disturbed pregnant woman could physically imprint a deformity onto her fetus through the force of her imagination alone. This was not folk belief. This was published in medical journals. Doctors recorded cases. Mothers reported the animal or event that had startled them. The timing was matched to the defect. It was taken seriously by trained physicians well into the 19th century. The actual mechanism, chromosomal, genetic, environmental, was not understood until the 20th century. The discovery of chromosomes as carriers of hereditary information came in the early 1900s. The chromosomal cause of Down syndrome was not identified until 1959. The genetic basis of neural tube defects was not properly understood until the 1990s. But what ancient communities were observing was real. Neural tube defects do cluster in families. Chromosomal abnormalities do increase with maternal age. Heart defects do repeat across generations. Cleft palate runs in bloodlines. Polydactyly behaves almost like a family marker. They were seeing genuine patterns. They were just building the wrong architecture around the patterns. And in building the wrong architecture, they created systems that assigned guilt, demanded punishment, and placed the entire weight of biological randomness onto individual women who had done nothing wrong. That is the part that did not need to survive into the modern era, and largely did not, but took longer to disappear than it should have. The thing about birth defects is that they have always forced the same question. One ancient people were never equipped to answer. Why does this happen to a child who has done nothing? Every system of meaning attempted an answer. The gods were displeased. The stars were misaligned. The mother had sinned. The blood was corrupt. None were correct. And in being incorrect, they placed the weight of the inexplicable onto the people who were already suffering most. The actual answer is quieter and stranger than any of them imagined. A neural tube that failed to close during week 4. A chromosome that duplicated when it should not have. A single B vitamin absent at the exact wrong moment. A forebrain that did not divide in time. 2 embryonic eye fields that never separated. The body is extraordinarily complex. The margin for error is extraordinarily small. And the errors have always been there. What is remarkable is not that birth defects happened. It is what happened around them. Ancient Mesopotamian scribes cataloging abnormalities with the same discipline they applied to tax records. A 4th century Chinese surgeon stitching lips closed with no understanding of genetics and no anesthesia. Egyptian priests preserved the bodies of anencephalic infants. Someone gave a pharaoh with Spina Bifida 130 walking sticks. Artists in pre-Columbian Colombia made careful ceramic portraits of people with Down syndrome. Chaco Canyon communities buried their 6-fingered members in places of ritual significance. The fear was real and consistent across every culture and every century. But so was something else. Something that looked Underneath all the wrong explanations and the misplaced blame and the omen tablets and the theories about hairs, something that looked a great deal like people trying, in whatever language they had available to them, to make sense of each other. The science gave us better language. The trying was always there.